Well, Grace Vineyard, we're back. It's virtual sermon number 2 of hopefully not very many more, but we'll see. We'll do this together as long as we need to do it. And although I miss you, I miss seeing you face to face, I'm glad that we have the technology at our disposal to be able to connect with each other a little bit anyway, and try to maintain some of the connectiveness that we have. I want to remind you again, just right up front, that if you need anything, please let somebody know, let me know, or we can just continue to help each other through this time and help each other get through safely and get through as a church and look for what God is doing in the world today, and we'll get through it all together. So I'm happy to be able to preach to you, even if it's through a screen, and I'm excited about getting back into James. It's been a really good study for me. I think it's the first time that I've really dove deep into James. It certainly is the first time I've preached through it. And so I've been gaining a lot out of it, and I hope that you have too. And it seems to be just real applicable to our time right now. You know, it's talking about a time when people are suffering, and we see that around us today. And so it's given us really great advice. So if you remember, as just a kind of a real brief review, James is calling us into this higher perspective. He's calling us to elevate our thoughts and our minds up to where God's point of view is. And he has a word for this perspective, and it's wisdom. So he's calling us into wisdom. If you remember, the book starts out with, consider it joy when you're going through suffering. And it's just this perspective shift. And so he's been kind of unpacking that throughout the book and trying to convince us to adopt this higher perspective. His advice to start with was, listen to God's voice in your heart and hold on to that and walk it out. Use your words to empower those actions, and be careful about the voices you're listening to and the perspective you're adopting. Make sure that it's peaceable, it's merciful, it's loving, it's consistent with what God says, or God would say to you, and God says in other places. And once you have that word, then just run with that. Just hold on to that for dear life, because it is life. It is peace. It's joy, and especially in times of suffering, because times of suffering just intensify our lives, and so everything seems more intense. And so if you can hold on to a perspective that considers all this joy, then you're really living a life that is a light to the world, and it can really affect the world. And he began to give applications of this last week. And the first application that he gave, if you remember, is don't go judging your brother. Because if you do that, you're just showing that you are adopting a lower perspective. Because if you judge and grumble your brother, you're actually judging and grumbling against the law of liberty, this higher perspective, this wisdom. Because this perspective says that person, that your brother is valuable, that he has needs and he has gifts. And if you are grumbling against him, you're actually setting yourself above not your brother, but above the perspective, the law of liberty is what he says. And who are you to judge that? And so don't be arrogant and thinking that this other perspective that you have in your flesh, or this worldly perspective, is above wisdom. Don't be arrogant. Don't be filled with this selfish ambition and jealousy, he says, but be humble, be meek, be quick to obey, and quick to be corrected. And so that was the first application of this wisdom principle. And he's going to go into the second and third application. We're going to talk about that. And then he has a little bit of advice getting towards the end of the book about how to walk out this perspective. So let's just jump into the next application. This is James chapter 4, starting in verse 13. He says this. It says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is a sin. When I was first going through this, I thought this was a warning against putting too much stock in the future. And it might be a little bit. He says, you don't know what's going to happen. Your life's a mist, it's a vapor. So to be careful about these kind of long-term plans. And so I thought it was a warning against taking too much stock in the future. But that didn't really match the end of the paragraph. He says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him is a sin. And that didn't really fit with that. And so I went back and I dug a little deeper, spent a little more time with it. And then I thought maybe it was a warning against boasting. He does say about boasting, he says, all such boasting is evil. But again, it didn't really match the conclusion, and if the conclusion doesn't match the argument, then there's a disconnect there. And so I kept going back and back to it and reading it and spending more time with it. And I think he's getting at something a little bit deeper here. I think the key to understanding this is that phrase, if the Lord wills. And I think what he's saying is that your plans to go to this or that city and to make a profit weren't necessarily the wisdom of God. You didn't seek out what the Lord wills, that voice inside of you that's guiding, and that we've been talking about this whole book. If that perspective that we're adopting isn't what's guiding our actions, then we haven't immersed ourselves in this wisdom. We haven't started living out this wisdom. And so if we're saying we're going to go to this in this town, despite what wisdom is telling us, what God is saying, then that is what he's talking about. That's what he's talking against. He's saying, if the Lord wills, go to this and this or that place, and conduct this or that business. And that makes a lot more sense with the conclusion that he makes. He says, therefore, so whoever knows the right things to do and fails to do it, for him it is a sin. And it's not just talking about, if you see somebody in need and you're not helping them, that's a sin. He's not talking necessarily just about like the classic sin of omission. What he's talking about is setting yourself up in arrogance, and that you're hearing God's voice, you're hearing the voice of wisdom leading you and directing your steps. But if you hear that and you don't follow it, that's what he's talking about. He's saying, for those of you who know what to do and don't do it, for you, that's a sin. And the word sin is actually an archery term. It means missing the mark. And so you have missed the mark if you're adopting that slower perspective, or if you fail to adopt this higher perspective. It's not just if walking out from this lower perspective, but it's failing to walk up in this higher calling of wisdom. And so that's the first application for this sermon. But the second application he's made, one, don't grumble about your brother. Don't judge your brother, because you're putting yourself above the perspective. Two, if you hear what you're to do, if you hear the voice of wisdom and you're not following it, for you, that is a sin. So don't do that. Follow that wisdom. That's the second application. The third application comes in chapter 5, starting in verse 1. He says this: "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosions will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He did not resist you. Boy, he just comes out with guns blazing on this one. He says, "Howl in misery, you who are rich." And I think he's dealing with a specific issue here that he's addressing, specific to the people he was writing to. And that doesn't mean that we can't learn anything from it, but this may be the part that he's said all of this up to this point to get to this part, to really address some wrongs, some people who are really hurting people by living down here. He says that you who are rich, you need to weep and wail because you know that you're temporary, that your castles that you're building, this empire that you're building, may or may not last. But he's saying that he says that your gold and silver are corroded, and that's evidence against you. Evidence for what? It's like, this is evidence that you're not spending your money to do good, that you're hoarding it up and it's corroded. Your clothes are moth-eaten. Well, only clothes that don't get worn get moth-eaten. The rest of the clothes just get worn out through use. So what good is these clothes? What good is this money? There's good that you could be doing with this stuff that you're not doing with this stuff, he says. And what's making it worse is that you are hoarding by defrauding people who work for you. This is a step worse. Not only are you not doing good with your money, but you're gaining this money through hurting people, through defrauding people. And this is just so antithetical to this wisdom higher calling that says people are valuable. It says that like Jesus says, you can't serve both God and money. He says that in Matthew chapter 6, that you gotta pick one. If you are focused, if your perspective is, I need to collect as much money as possible, then you're living down here, and you're willing to defraud your workers. You're willing to not pay them fair wages. You're willing to hoard these resources when they could be out doing good. But if you are serving God instead of money, or as Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you, in that same chapter that I just referenced. If you're seeking first the kingdom, well, then now your resources that you have can be used for good, to bring the kingdom to God. And your clothes won't be moth-eaten. Your gold and silver won't be corroded because they're being put to use. And this is what James is talking about here. He's saying this perspective that you've adopted has led you to some atrocious behavior. It has led you to value the wrong thing completely. And it has led you to actually hurt people. And those cries from those people have reached up to heaven's ears, reached up to the God of hosts, and they're calling out against you. And so he's just showing in this specific instance the result of the path that these people are on. And before we go on and think, well, okay, that was a specific instance that doesn't have anything to do with me. Well, let's just take the warning. Let's be humble and at least just take the warning and see if it fits. And if it does stick, then we need to do some repenting. So ask yourself, am I serving God over money, or am I serving money over God? And have I, or do I, hear the voice of wisdom to give resources away, to be generous, and not taking that action? Or do I take resources, even maybe by hurting other people, and hoard them to myself? Do I look to myself to fill my own needs above the people around me? And now there's no statement against having resources here. The statement that he's saying is, if you prioritize your resources over wisdom, if you bring your perspective from up here down here, and now I'm viewing my resources down here where it's a me first attitude, then that is what is twisted, what is earthly, what is unspiritual, what is demonic, he says. And so So don't do that. Again, he's calling us up to this higher perspective. Again, he's calling us up to adopt this higher perspective. And now he's coming to a section where he's going to give us a little bit of advice about walking this out. So he's given us these 3 practical applications, and now he's going to give us some advice, starting in verse 7 of chapter 5. This is verse 7 and verse 8. He says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your heart, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." So be patient until wisdom is proved true. This is a process. This is a journey. It's not just something you can adopt and then be done with it. This is something you have to live out, you have to walk out in patience, because oftentimes it feels like what we're doing is not leading to anything good. I'm sure that you felt that way. I felt that way in my life, where I felt like I was doing the right thing and I felt like it just kept going south on me. What he's saying is just be patient. Let wisdom be proved true through time. Look at your life through time after adopting wisdom as your perspective. Let it play out. Let it just give it some air. Be patient with it. He says, be patient. And he goes on, he says, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So he wants you to, in patience, establish your perspective, because Jesus is coming back. The coming of the Lord is at hand. He's coming back. And you want to be found living in patience, living in wisdom when that happens. And he goes on, continuing in verse 9, he says, "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." He says, he's putting up this contrast between grumbling against your brothers and patience. And then he gives us an example. He says, look at the prophets. These guys adopted this wisdom perspective in patience, and their whole lives was an exercise in patience. If you think of through the prophets, I mean, if you think of like Jeremiah, for example, his calling was, okay, Jeremiah, I have a message for you. I want you to go to Israel and deliver this message. Nobody's going to listen to you. They're going to hate you for it. But I want you to do it anyway. And he was faithful to that perspective and that message with patience. And the result of his life was the stories that we still read and are encouraged by. They're still in this scripture. Although in his life, it probably felt like his good was doing no good. His message wasn't doing any good. And the example that James uses is the story of Job. He says, look, this guy was patient in his suffering. He was steadfast in his perspective. And at the end of the book of Job, he did get a little perspective tweak at the end. But still, he walked through this wisdom as best he could in patience. And he was upheld by it. He's an example of patience and long suffering in this. And so we don't grumble against each other. We don't say, woe is me. We don't throw ourselves a pity party because the perspective that we have adopted, we think is a higher calling, but we don't see any instant gratification out of it. He says, be patient, because, and I love what he says in verse 11. He says, the Lord's purposes are compassionate and merciful. This is the confidence that we bring to the table, that the Lord's purposes, what he's doing in you, whether you see it or not, whether it is in this lifetime you see it or you don't get to see it, like the people who are suffering in the book of James, they didn't necessarily get to see all of the benefits that we live in because the gospel is spread because of their persecution. But we know that the Lord's purposes, whatever they are compassionate and merciful, because that's the God we serve. So we come to this perspective with patience, knowing that maybe I don't get to see right away this harvest of righteousness that he promised in the last chapter, or the end of chapter 3, but we know it's coming. And maybe we will get to see it. That's a real possibility. But even if we don't, we know that the Lord's purposes are merciful and compassionate. And that's a promise that we can just sink our teeth in, and we can grab a hold of. We can cozy up to it at night and know that the purposes of the Lord, whatever is going on in our lives, the purposes of the Lord that will not be thwarted are merciful and compassionate. And we get to be on that team if we adopt the higher perspective. If we walk out wisdom in our lives, we get to be players in this bringing compassionate and mercy into the world as we walk. So let's read one more verse today. This is the last little piece of advice we're going to get to. This is James chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, you might be thinking, what in the world does swearing have to do with what we're talking about? And that's frankly where I was earlier this week. And so I spent more time with it, just thinking about it. And I came to realize that, well, I asked myself, who is it that needs to swear to be believed? Well, it's somebody that is inconsistent with their perspective, inconsistent with their lifestyle. The people who flip-flop between sometimes they're out for you, sometimes they're out for themselves, sometimes they tell the truth, sometimes they don't. Those are the people who have to swear to be believed. So don't be like that. Don't be inconsistent. Walk out who you are consistently. Adopt this higher perspective and continue on with it. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. And don't do anything else besides that. Continue in patience and in endurance to walk out this. Don't be the type of person that has to swear to be believed. You don't need to be that person. Over time, if you are consistent, then your reputation, who you are as a person, will be known, and you won't have to indulge in swearing or trying to convince people who you are, because you're a person who says yes and means yes, and who says no and means no. And so, we just don't need to bounce back and forth. So we're going to stop there for today, but I want to again just emphasize that we need to seek out the truth of our situation. And this is so important right now, because there is so much uncertainty. There's so much just stress about our world today that we need to be able to hear the voice of the Lord about what's going on with us, what's going on in our situation. Despite the facts, we need to hold on to the truth. The truth is God is moving. The truth is God is calling us to be a light in a dark place. And the darker the world gets, the brighter the light shines. And so be looking for opportunities to be peace for people who need peace, to be joy for people who need joy, to be generous to people who need generosity. And we have set up a mechanism for you to be generous. For those of you who are members of our church, you have access to this generosity fund. These stories are starting to come in, and they're really great stories. We're really impacting people with this perspective that no, now is the time to give it away. Now is the time that we put our money where our mouth is and say, no, God is our provider. We trust that He will provide for us. And so we now have something to offer. So let me just encourage you, use those if you need to. If if you've come across somebody, I know we're not really around as many people as we usually are, but even in the virtual space or the online space, if you come across somebody who needs a little bit of light, needs a little bit of kindness, mercy, be the one to give them a kind word. Be the one to say, things are going to be okay. Things are going to be okay. There's a God in heaven, and his purposes are merciful. His purposes are compassionate. So, Grace Vineyard, I love you so much. I miss you, and I can't wait to see you again. But until we get together, we'll keep talking over this screen, and I hope that you're feeling a little bit more connected to the congregation through this. Be quick to call people. Be quick to check on people. You don't even have to have a reason. I'm giving you total permission and the reason that you need to call somebody up and just say, "Hey, you doing all right? Let's connect and let's chat a little bit." Let me pray for you, and then I'll let you get on to your day. God, I love you so much. We're so glad that you are moving in all things, that you consider problems that from the place of victory and not from a place of lack. I would pray that you would help us to adopt your perspective. Give us wisdom. Help us to walk it out. Teach us to be kind and teach us to be generous. Teach us to bring the kingdom here on earth just like it is in heaven. We love you so much, and we're so excited about what you're doing. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. Look, if you need something, let us know. If you need prayer for something, let us know. We have people praying, and so please, if you need a personal call, somebody to pray for you over the phone, whatever you need, please let us know. We love you so much, and we'll see you soon. God bless.